So thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, I think, first of all, it would be really good to know a bit of context about yourself. So you studied at King's College London. You have a background in computing. So I think it would be really nice to know what inspired your move into media and how was your technical background influenced by your leadership approach?
Great. Well, that's a very big question. A lot to cover there. A little bit about my background and my story. I was born in southern India. My parents left India when I was 11. They briefly lived in the Middle East before they moved to London. They still live here. I come here often. I spend the weekend with them. That was wonderful. I am a British American. So Britain is my home. This is where I travel with my kids every summer. I come here a lot, so it's a country that's very close to my heart. And it did a lot for me. So I joined King's College London to do my undergrad. Like a lot of folks from the South Asian community, I did do engineering. I was a very good student. When I was 19, I had finished my undergrad and I had an option to either go to Oxford to pursue my PhD or to stay in London. The director of the research center had known me well. He had followed my progress in undergrad. I was quite a good student. You guys are all exceptional, but I think I was a fairly good student. I had won 7 awards in my undergrad, so I got a direct admission to PhD with full funding. He had found out that I had an option to go to Oxford or stay at King's, and he called me and I said, hey, look, I'm willing to give you full scholarship, but you got to decide now whether you're going to stay here or you're going to go there, because I got 50 people in a queue, for this spot. So I said, okay, I'll stay in London. London is a pretty phenomenal city. Well, UK has a lot of great assets. So, living in New York, I just spent a lot of time with the Consul General of the UK, and we're all talking about, what are the great things in the UK that we can be proud about and promote in the US, and there's so many amazing things, right? Look, we have an amazing university here, which is globally famous, so historic, so iconic, that shaped the world. You have a great city in London. There are so many amazing things. So I feel in many ways I was a product of that. Living in London, I was exposed to an amazing international community. It's also the center of the media world in many ways. Some of the greatest media agencies are out of London. WPP, which is one of the biggest ad agencies in the world, is based out of London. There's so much creativity that happens there. And also journalism has a long history in the UK, right? You have so many iconic British brands here. But of course, my PhD was on mobile internet, particularly looking at internet protocols. But one thing that was very clear was, this is mid-2000s, pre-iPhone, but we were working on fast bandwidth, wireless bandwidth, the things that we use today, 5G, LTE, these things were being researched then. They were theoretical. So you know that there's going to be a massive bandwidth pipe that's coming. And when that comes, the amount of applications you can run on top of it are going to change the way we consume information, right? I think many of you may be too young, but those who have used internet in the early 2000s, it would take you 2 to 3 days to download a movie, right? Now it's unthinkable you could stream a movie, right? The concept of streaming did not exist there. So when bandwidth increased, what you can do on it is just dramatically changes, right? So in parallel, obviously, while I was about to finish my PhD, iPhone had just launched. But in parallel, Google was growing very fast. And it started to massively disrupt the print industry. For generations, for maybe 7, 8 decades, the print industry had not changed, right? That's the only way people could consume written information. And there was no change for generations. Different executives came and went and nothing changed. So the concept of reinventing the business did not exist for them. If you're in many other industries, people change the way they behave over time, so they have to come up with new products. But this industry, that change did not happen. And then around mid-2000s, Google introduced digital advertising, search-based advertising. Suddenly the marketeers had massive opportunity to target their audience with very sophisticated advertising, right? Rather than just a static print ad, they could target you when you're searching for a hotel or a flight, when you're looking to complete an intention, right, to buy, seek, or something. at that point they could reach you and divert you and promote their products. That level of dynamic advertising did not exist before. So of course, all the advertisers start to move the budget there. They start to get budget from elsewhere and push it there. Within a few years, the ad budgets in print shrank and the ad budgets in digital just expanded, right? So it was around that time, I was finishing my PhD. That was 2009, in the middle of the financial crisis. Despite that, the digital media and digital advertising industry was growing in double digits, right? Because of that dramatic disruption and innovation that was happening. Now, of course, there are many things happening in parallel. Newsweek at that time, in 2009, because of this change from print to digital, was sold for $1 with nearly $50 million of debt, right? By this company that had owned it for nearly 60 plus years. The same company also owned Washington Post in DC. Now, when I finished my PhD, I had an opportunity to remain in academia, which I was not very eager to because I spent too long in a university. I wanted to go and do something else. Obviously, I had saved up some money because I got a scholarship and stipend. I didn't spend much. So I thought I could dip my toes in a startup and see what happens. Around that time, there was a person I had known from London who had gone to America and started a company called IBT Media, which was a digital-first publication, and he and a few others asked if I'd be interested in launching their version in the UK as a complete startup. And I thought I will see what happens. But because at that time it was growing, that industry was growing double-digit, there was such a fast growth in that sector. A startup in the UK that was about 3 people went up to 150 people in a few years. And then this company in the US ended up buying Newsweek in 2013. So that's how the whole Newsweek thing came about. Now, going back to your question, the whole disruption of print to digital happened because of internet, right? And in many ways, that's what I did my PhD on. So people always think, this industry is just about content. But today, it's a digital media. It runs on internet, right? It runs on technology. And in many ways, being an engineer, I was very good at solving problems, dealing with very complex systems, and building a new ecosystem that's digitally friendly, right? From that perspective, I felt in many ways my background was very, very helpful.
Yeah, amazing. And as someone of Indian heritage who now leads a major global American media brand, how have your cultural experience shaped your worldview and leadership style?
Well, coming from the Indian community, for us it was very important to work very hard, be very loyal and very dedicated. So those things, shaped my worldview in whatever I did. And of course, I'm a British American. I became an American citizen 2 years ago. Obviously, when you do take an oath, you're very clear, which country you have your priorities to. And America is a very complex country, right, compared to here. Europe has a much more progressive or liberal view. America has both liberal and progressive views, right? I know you're having a debate later with someone, and you'd really see, he will help you see what a big portion of America sees, right, and why they kept voting for someone like President Trump. When you do speak to someone like Charlie Kirk, you would see that perspective. So America has a very vast political and cultural spectrum. Also coming from that community, I was very comfortable in a complex environment. Spending the first few years in India, I was used to a lot of complexity and a lot of gray areas. So having a very pluralistic view was not very difficult for me. People with very different perspectives or very opposing perspectives was not difficult for me to comprehend. And I was always very keen to see how we can find common ground so we can all, cohabit and live peacefully. And in many ways, the reinvention of Newsweek we had was more about digital reinvention of it, which we had to be relevant in today's world. But also, how do we ensure that it's a publication that people across America find relevant, right? Because by the time I had taken over, it had progressively became a publication that only the coastal elite had a relationship to. But the middle of America is vast. It's very influential and very powerful. There are a lot of industries, and there's also a lot of people there. How do you build a product that's really relevant for all of them? Right? That was a challenge that I felt, we were able to address pretty early on.
Mm. And obviously, Newsweek underwent a major turnaround under your leadership. And so I think it's quite interesting to know, what were the biggest challenges you faced when taking over, and how did you navigate them, and how did your experience that you'd had before help you navigate those challenges?
So, whenever I attend the class at Harvard Business School where they teach the turnaround of Newsweek, first of all, I didn't realize, I was really in the thick of the moment when we did everything. It's when I was finishing up my exec program, I met a few professors there, and they were quite surprised about the turnaround because they said turnarounds are very difficult and very rare. Thankfully, I didn't know that when I got into this because that would really spook me out pretty bad. And they were very interested to know how we did it. But I say these a few things, right? First, we had to reinvent the business model completely because Newsweek had a business model on the print side. It didn't make it to the digital side, right? So it came to me to execute that reinvention, building a new business model that's relevant in the digital world. Number two, the culture at Newsweek never transformed from a print-centric culture to a digital-centric culture. That's number two. And number three, for nearly a decade, Newsweek went through a series of mismanagement under a number of previous owners. Typically, any one of these issues in a company could destroy it, right? So we unfortunately had all three of it together. And before my time, some incredibly wealthy people had owned Newsweek, right? A couple of billionaires had owned Newsweek. There's an article, I don't know how true it is or not, about 7, 8, or close to 10 years ago, they spent more than $100 million trying to turn it around and lost all of it. So a lot of research and a lot of very capable people had tried. But sometimes I joke, what if all these three difficult forces together is probably what made us successful in the sense that because it was so complex, we had to do something quite extraordinary, right? We pushed to the limit, and we really had to do something quite extraordinary to make this transformation. So that drove us to be incredibly lean, incredibly efficient, and really we gave it absolutely all, right? So I've always been a very tenacious person. When I set my mind on something, I guess, you guys would resonate. You're all super, super smart people. That's why you're here. To be really successful, you have to make a lot of sacrifices, right? Without sacrifices, you can't be here. When all your friends are out partying and doing silly stuff, you're studying and you're working hard. So you have to make a lot of sacrifices. If you work 9 to 5, that's not going to happen. It was 24/7 working, being very focused, and also deconstructing the problem with a lot of practical solutions, right? If you look at tech companies, the very successful companies that scale, like Google, and several years ago, Intel and many others, use a framework called OKRs. It's actually a very simple framework that breaks down a plan into, if you have an objective, what are the 3 measurable things you're going to do to achieve the objective? So everything's very measurable. It's not a complicated plan that has a lot of words, but it's very measurable and very actionable. And in many ways, I felt engineers are very practical, right? We say, well, we got to fix this. This is what a solution looks like, and how are we going to track it? How are we going to make sure it really happens? So it's a mix of all of these things coming together and really intense focus on execution. And the fact that if you don't do it, there's literally no other way out. That's pretty much the final nail on the coffin, right? And of course, we had a very good digital strategy. We executed it. We changed the culture of the company. And to be honest, we were a little surprised how fast the market responded to that. It showed that the brand was still very relevant. When we are able to produce content that in a new economic ecosystem that balanced the revenue and the cost, and we were able to take content to the American public, they still resonated with the brand. They didn't realize the journey the brand had gone through, right? That was really an inside baseball game. They were still very thirsty to hear from Newsweek, and our readership went from, I think in 2017, we had like 7-8 million people reading Newsweek, and within about 4 or 5 years, we had up to 100 million people reading us monthly.
Incredible. And I know you've spoken about transitioning Newsweek into a digital-first brand. So obviously with that comes responsibility, and I think what's interesting is how and what does responsibility in terms of journalism look like in today's polarized, algorithm-driven media environment?
Right, that's an extremely important question that's super relevant right now, especially in America, but all over the world. So my first experience was when we embarked on the digital first strategy, our audience really went up. And we use a lot of real-time tools to look at what stories are doing really well and what's not. And one day I was really surprised when I looked at the dashboard. All the top 10 stories that day had a very particular political leaning, such a strong political leaning. It was almost to the point of undermining and mocking the other side. So it kind of was, I kept seeing that day after day, and suddenly it struck to me, what sort of company am I building, right? Is this the company I want to build? And another feedback was I kind of met someone from the other side who was on the receiving end of some of our coverage, and I could also see the amount of hatred and anger they had towards us. And I was like, well, the words, what we write really does have an impact on the other side, so we really need to do this in a more thoughtful way, right? Rather than be like, hey, let's just go after someone and in that pursuit, cater to our portion of the audience and make them very happy. So we kind of try to go back to the roots of Newsweek and think about how do you build a product that's really relevant to people, as many Americans as possible, that's true to the heritage of Newsweek.
Yeah.
When you went back to Newsweek in the 60s, 70s, 80s, the brand was read by people across America, right? They had a Midwest edition, a Texas edition, and it wasn't just a publication for the coastal elites, which it had progressively become over a period of time. And I think it's a danger where, a few of us, especially those who think they're very smart or very capable, see the world in a particular way and expect everyone else to follow, right? In a democracy, just because you see a version of the world doesn't mean everyone else has to follow. They have their say and they can express their say during an election, right? So you have to be very mindful of that. So we kind of came up with a new mission statement of how we want to build Newsweek. And the first bullet point of that was Newsweek speaks to and listens to people across the political and cultural spectrum. In many ways, we thought there was a very classical liberal viewpoint that we want to listen to different perspectives, right, rather than just one perspective. Of course, there are extreme perspectives that we don't want, right? Being an engineer, we have something called a bandpass filter. Like you have a band of frequencies or spectrums of views that you can accept. Of course, if someone's on the crazy saying, well, people who don't look like they should be killed or eliminated, of course, we don't want those sort of views. But there's such a diverse views that we can listen to and learn, even if you don't agree with, understand their perspective, right? So that kind of formed the basis of what we did. So we came up with this product called The Debate. In fact, the gentleman who's coming later today, surprisingly, I found it only today, he was one of the first people we onboarded from the other side, from the conservative side, to be part of our debate platform. And of course, we did face a lot of resistance. And my view was, as long as he or she is not saying anything, inflammatory or it's rooted on facts, they should be given a platform to talk about their worldview, right? And I think it's important, even if you don't agree, we learn to appreciate their perspective, right? And we all grow as a society together. So that's kind of how we came up with the debate. And in order to have a debate, you guys have debates, you want opposing views, right? And that's an amazing intellectual exercise to go through. So when did we become a publication or a group of people who don't want to hear opposing views, right? And I think that's a basics of democracy. If you look at authoritarian regimes, they are the ones who don't want views that don't align with them, and they completely eliminate them, right? So we try to incorporate all of this. So now, fast forward several years later, we have evolved from that. We come up with a group of metrics called fairness and trustworthiness. So again, I was talking to some folks from Google, and they were saying everything they do, they like to measure. Even if they can't find a scientific way to measure, they would use panels or polls to measure. So we had an idea of how do we know what we're writing is fair, right? So at the bottom of our articles, we were one of the first publication to do, we have something called the fairness meter. So we let our own audience rate if they believe our articles are fair or not, right? And because we have kind of gone on this journey, we have already built an internal mechanism to make sure that we cover complex stories as fairly as possible. And we have over 4 million people who have voted, and about 70% of our readers do say, what we cover is fair. So we do believe that it's very important to produce stories or cover very complex stories, having fairness at the heart of it. And it's also not just what we do. We have at least 3 independent agencies, including a YouGov poll, that has said that the trust on Newsweek among American readers is on its way up.
Brilliant. And especially within the current age of tech and AI, how do you see the role of legacy media evolving in the next 5 years? And obviously with AI-generated content becoming more and more dominant in the space, and the decline of public trust in traditional outlets, how do you see that legacy evolving?
Well, so AI is a very, very powerful tool. Like with any powerful tool, you could have, good things come out of it and not good things come out of it, right? Now, of course, if there are people who are good at promoting misinformation, now they have a very powerful tool with which they can, just with a click of a button, produce so much content and push it out there, right? Or they could just write a bot that would just generate so much content, keep pushing it out. So that's the danger of it. I think there are layers of challenges with AI, right? But I think in an era where there's going to be so much AI-generated content out there, people will be curious to know what are the things I can trust and what are the things I cannot trust. We give so much emphasis to making sure that our content is always, even if someone writes it, an editor checks it, fact checks it, make sure it's proper, it's valid. We have attribution from all different sites. You're writing about someone, we reach out for a comment, all of these things, right? So that's such a strong editorial process that's there. And that's why we feel our readers will continue to trust what we produce as opposed to what a machine produces, right? Of course, if you're rewriting what the score of a game is, a machine can do that, right? Either someone can go and look what the score is or a machine can produce that. And that has been going on for a while. Financial wire services have been doing that for a while. When someone releases the every quarterly results, they will use AI to get the news out as quick as possible because traders use that to trade. So that's been going on for a while. So our view is that, if we stay true to our core values, we would remain even more relevant than we were before. Now, of course, there are challenges too because the way people consume information may change, right? Yeah. They may use AI chatbots to consume news rather than come to our website. Now, an AI chatbot may summarize news from 10 of the best publications and give it to someone. So how do we make money in that ecosystem? So those are the things that really makes us super nervous. But the fact that there's going to be so much AI-produced content is probably a good thing for us in the sense that people will come to us for clarification.
That's very interesting. And I think in extension of that, this is a common debate, especially here within the union where we are a place of free speech. Where do you draw the line at Newsweek when defending free speech, but also curbing misinformation, and especially when platforming, controversial or fringe perspectives? How do you kind of find that line?
So that's a very, very good question. So we have a very strong opinion desk who deal with different perspectives, right? So there's obviously the reporting part, which is not part of the opinion desk. So reporting is purely based on facts, what happens. We are just reporting what's happening, right? There is no room for opinion there, right? If so-and-so event happened, this is what the person said. There's no opinion or anything like that there. Of course, the issue of trust really comes about how do you frame an issue, right? I mean, today this particular week, there's a big issue going on in the US about President Biden's health, especially when he decided to run for the second term, right? A lot of people were of the view that he was in good health and he should have quit earlier, but some people do believe his inner circle covered that up, right? So of course, these issues can happen. The job of reporters is to dig deeper into that. So I think as journalism companies, there's a lot of soul searching for us to do to see why we didn't do that. And even this week there was a book called Original Sin that was published that really talks about the failure of journalists to do that, right? So reporting is reporting. It really relies on facts. Now, in America, you have freedom of speech is a constitutional right? Also, freedom of press is a constitutional right. So it kind of puts us in a very unique place. So it gives people the freedom to say a lot of things, unless it's their intention to use the speech to maliciously harm or cause damage to someone. So in that framework, how do you govern? How do you decide what someone can say and not say? So our editorial team, the op-ed team, do have very rigorous perspectives on what are the things they can allow and not allow. Of course, we lean towards trying our best to platform well thought out, constructive viewpoints, not reckless viewpoints, right? That's written with a view to cause damage. And as long as we're able to fit within those guidelines, which of course, I have professional editors who kind of really deal with that. And if things get very controversial, we always like to have an opposing view to go with it, right? Here are at least two different perspectives on it. This is not just one view. And the other side often, debates with this particular view or is able to say, hey, this is a different perspective to that.
Brilliant. And obviously Newsweek has experienced controversies in the recent years, from ownership disputes to questions around kind of editorial direction. How do you respond to critics who argue that the brand has drifted from its journalistic roots?
Well, the whole journalism is evolving, right?
Yeah.
So we take it very, very seriously to stay true to our history and heritage, right? And the way we've always addressed this issue is by going back to the roots of being a trustworthy publication, right? So we don't try and publish for our industry peers. We try and publish for our readers. And we really take it very, very seriously what our readers tell us. And that's why we came up with a fairness meter. And we also follow at least two different independent agencies that track where we are, right? So it's very important for us to be a centrist publication. And it was also very important for us to track how trustworthy people feel about our own coverage. So those are pretty much the North Star KPIs that we really focus on. And in many ways, that's why we think we have been very successful, right? The American public and the American readers have really resonated with our content.
Brilliant. And how do you ensure that leadership at a media organization kind of maintains its integrity and transparency, especially in the era of really public media skepticism? Well,
I think it starts with being, very honest and very candid about, some of our own failures. I still remember in 2016 when I had just gone to America. This was just before the presidential elections between Trump and Hillary Clinton. A week before the election had happened, the then Newsweek team had assumed that Hillary Clinton was going to win because that's what everyone thought was going to happen. And they had already published a special issue called Madam President. And not only that, they had also shipped it out, right? And when I saw that, I was absolutely horrified because I was in the UK when Brexit happened, and everyone said Brexit is not going to happen, but it did. So I was absolutely horrified, and I spoke to the editorial leadership team, and all they said is, well, don't worry, this is never going to happen. Trump is never going to win, right? So when you have this sort of viewpoint among journalists, and then of course the reality was very different, people do make perception that, the media companies and a lot of the journalists do have very strong biases, and they keep pushing their biases out rather than wait for what's really happening. So in many ways, I think, and also what happened with the President Biden's coverage of President Biden's health, right? Is ultimately it's during the debate when people start to see, of course, he's looking very old and fragile. That's when people start to openly talk about it. So now there's one line of thought that had that been reported early on, he might have stepped down early and allowed someone, else to stand in his place, right? So I think in many ways it starts with us being very candid about it. And I also think, we have to go back to regaining the trust. We have to be very, very intentional. Someone was once joking, it's often the journalists and the politicians, those are the two professions that people have the least amount of trust.
Yeah.
So, if that is the reality, then, you just have to accept that and work very hard to regain the trust. And I think in many ways, it's very helpful to find ways to measure that. I mean, we have a very, simplistic way of measuring directly from our readers. And also today, people can go and consume information directly from people, right, via Twitter or X and social media. So we're also competing with that, right? So I think it's a challenge. But I think if you remain true to your core values and true to regaining trust and are persistent, I think we can.
Amazing. And I think just before we head to some public questions, I think I've got one more, and it's kind of got to do with like the future of news group. So what does success look like for you at Newsweek? And if you were 20 years old again and a student, what advice would you give to yourself?
Right. Let me answer the first part. What does success look like? For the company, the turnaround has been a pretty dramatic ride for us, right? At the lowest point, Newsweek had just 5 employees. Today we have 400 employees working for us. We are about a 9-figure revenue business that's profitable in 8 figures for a few years now. So the business turnaround story has been very, very successful. I think to build a publication that represents a broader political spectrum has also been very rewarding. There's so much more work we can do to advance that. We kind of call that one of the narratives we use, that is finding common ground. When you have different perspectives or opposing views, we love to see how we can help people find common ground, right? So I think working and advancing those sort of things, I find that very rewarding. When I was doing engineering, we did a lot of math, and especially I had a lot of optimization theory and mathematical programming, and it's all about optimizing a function, right? You optimize something subject to constraints. I think in journalism, there are 2 things you are having to do. For a long time, people didn't have to think about the business part. They were just focused on the editorial mission, which is very inspiring. And in America, of course, the Constitution gives us protection, right? Freedom of press. So it's very hard for people to attack the press. So there was not a lot of discipline in building a solid business. So my view is, I think you should work towards a mission, an editorial mission. That's the most inspiring thing. So that could be the function we are really trying to optimize and maximize. But it should also be subject to a lot of discipline, business operation, right? Because if you don't run it as a business, it goes under. Before you know, you have to start laying off people and start to shut down the business. So I think that part of the business is going well. We like to also see ourselves as an entrepreneurial business. We have to keep growing, keep expanding, because the landscape we are in is also changing very fast. We don't know how AI is going to disrupt us, so we have to be on our toes and constantly keep innovating. So that's what success would look like, right, for us a few years from now. So what advice would I give when going back 20 years? That's a hard one, because hindsight is a wonderful thing, right? I think now look, different people have different priorities, right, and different appetite for what they want to do, what sort of risk they want to take, which path they want to pursue. Some people prefer independence, some people have a high tolerance for risk. But if you are a very, very ambitious person, I wish someone had told me that, if you're very ambitious, you don't have to have very rigid boundaries, right? If you're ambitious, you're very hardworking and you're very creative. There are a lot of things you can do if you don't put yourself in a small box. In many ways, it helped that the way I reinvented Newsweek, I was an outsider. So people were thinking about Newsweek as, because they've been in the industry for so long, it's news plus week, right? For generations, it was like with Time magazine, it was a weekly publication. So I kind of came from outside. I just saw Newsweek as a brand, not just a weekly. In digital, you just have to change the frequency with which you're going to publish. So we just have to, as a digital publication, we can publish once a day, or 10 times a day, or 100 times a day. It was that simple perspective, difference in perspective, that allowed us to build everything that we did, right? So I think if you're able to apply that in your regular life, because people tell you all these things, that this is how you're supposed to think, this is how it's supposed to be, but maybe it doesn't have to be that way, right? But of course, you have to. That's the reason why those guardrails are there. But those things are also changing, and not, the conventional wisdom is not always true.
Amazing. So I think just before we wrap up, we'll put the questions to the floor if anyone's got a question that they'd like to ask Dev. Yeah, go at the front. Oh.
Hi, it was a pleasure to meet you earlier. I just wanted to say, on the matter of the Constitution and the freedom of the press, do you think in an age of direct content sharing, the definition of what the press is needs to be revisited?
Well, that's a very profound question. I think changing the Constitution is really up to the people and the lawmakers, right? So it's a very profound question, and that needs major consensus among a lot of very important people. I think that's going to be very, very hard, if I'm being very honest. I think the question really is, it's more about maybe not so much of the press, but what platforms are responsible for and liable for, because they are the biggest distributors in the world, right? Today, any of you can post something that anyone in the world can read. So who's responsible for that sort of distribution? So the law in the US is that the platforms are not responsible. They're like, hey, we're just a platform and we're not responsible. I think if anything, the decision on that is probably going to be the most critical one.
Anyone else got a question? Yeah, at the front.
Thank you. You've spoken a lot about trying to maintain trust with your readers and trying to maintain a kind of centrist perspective. You referenced the Washington Post earlier. Given that they have said that they're going to pursue very much kind of neoliberal free market ideas in the scope of their opinion writing, what is your, also having a news business, what is your opinion on companies limiting their political perspectives in that sense? And do you think there is a place for that in your own company?
Well, the short answer is, if there's a place for that, yes, because we like to have, a different brain and various perspectives, right? So definitely, we definitely not a company where we say, well, that's not a view we will take, and it's not, and we don't do editorials. We don't say, hey, this is what we really stand for. Of course, in a way that trying to be centrist in a way that we like to have different perspectives. That's what we stand for. So of course, we'd love to have that, but we'll also love to have an opposing view, right? So the reader has a holistic view on what all of those things mean. But of course, it's very hard for me to comment on what other companies want to do. That's really up to their owners and their governance structure and what the leadership team want to do, right?
Cool. Yeah, we'll go right at the back and Nordin.
Thank you for coming today. I wanted to have your thoughts on the changes over the last 10, 15 years in terms of, say, videos going from 20 minutes being normal to 20 seconds or 5 seconds. Have you seen any changes in kind of what people like to read in terms of length of articles and types of articles? Do your journalists now go for really short articles that people can read within a minute or two, as opposed to really long, in-depth pieces that take a lot longer to read? Or has that not really affected anything?
Well, that's again a great question. So I think it also depends on the type of coverage that you are doing. So we definitely do, long-form journalism, especially the magazine pieces. They take a while to produce, and they also take a while to consume, right? So that's more a lean-back read, where people read when they have time, and they want to really go deeper into a topic. Those tend to be, an in-depth feature on something, an in-depth interview, or in-depth analysis on something. But also, people on a day-to-day basis, they're also consuming information very quickly, right? If something happened, they want to know, in a relatively short period of time what's happening and move on. Now, companies are now even starting to experiment with AI that summarizes an article. So if someone does not have time, they can just read just the gist of it or what the article is about and then come back and take a deeper dive, right? I think the way to look at this is to see what the consumer really wants and be able to provide them in the format that they want, right? And I think in many ways, AI is a tool that could be very, very helpful for that.
Are there any other questions? I wonder if we've got time for one or two more. Yeah?
Yeah, so in the turnaround of Newsweek, you need an ambitious team to make such a transformation and a turnaround. How did you get that buy-in from the wider team to execute a plan to turn the whole thing around?
So, when I took over Newsweek, things were really, really dire and really bad. I think by the time I was on board, it was literally like the edition was very binary. Either we're going to make it or it's over. And when I came up with a plan, it literally was either we are in or we are out, right? It was so binary. There was no place to be like, hey, what about this? What about that? What about we do nothing? Doing nothing or just speculating and trying to redraw the plan really meant one thing. I think in many ways that was very helpful in decision making because it helped drive a real sense of urgency, right? Thankfully, I had a few leaders who were so core to what we're doing, who believed in it, right? Had they not believed in it, I don't know what would have happened, right? I would have to figure out another path forward. But a vast majority of the people were very hungry to kind of find a way to save Newsweek. Because it was an iconic brand. A lot of people did have a very strong emotional connection to it. And even now, the amount of support I've received from really veteran journalists to people who have been in the industry for so long, who are incredibly happy with the work the team and I have done, is really inspiring. I think it's a lot of that really helped galvanize the team to give the one last shot to see if we can save the brand.
I think maybe one more. Is any? Yeah, right at the back.
I think just over your time at Newsweek, has there been anything that's like really surprised you, like while you've been there? Like, what's the most surprising thing about like the industry or just the role?
The thing that I find, I don't know if it's surprising or the most intriguing thing is media is actually, news media is actually a very small industry, right, when you compare to some of the very large industries. But somehow, despite it being a small industry, and most media companies are relatively small to medium-sized businesses, when you think about really big industrial businesses, they have hundreds of thousands of employees, have tens of billions, even the biggest media company has a few billions in revenue, right? Most media companies have a few hundred millions in revenue and few thousand employees. But somehow, despite that, it's such a larger-than-life industry. Wherever you go, people across the world seem to know. Even when I was in my Harvard business school classroom, there were the company net worth in the classroom runs into billions because almost everyone there is the owner, manager. And some of them run multi-billion-dollar businesses, but not many people knew who they were. But the moment they say, well, that's the CEO, owner of Newsweek, everyone's like super excited by that, right? I found that very peculiar and very intriguing because it's very hard to make sense of it, right? And in many ways, it kind of gets to you because you're not, the person next to you could be running a $5 billion business, but you're running like a significantly smaller business compared to that, but the spotlight is on you rather than that person. And that sometimes can really, really mess you up, right? So sometimes I wonder if a lot of the problems that the media faces, somehow connected to that.
Amazing. I think if there's no other questions. Oh, yep, one more.
Yeah. So you mentioned this idea of AI and transforming of media now. How do you see the future of digital media with AI, and what would you tell someone who wants to build a new platform now?
Well, that's a great question. Well, AI is definitely a disruptive and a transformative tool, right? And every person who knows technology really well has said this may be the most transformative technology out there. So it is actually a little, if I'm being very candid, a little spooky with the level of transformation this is going to drive or the disruption that it's going to drive. Because in many ways we felt we transformed from a print to a digital business. Now we have to again drive another round of transformation. I think the way, at least from our perspective, there are a few ways to look at it, right? One, we all have to embrace AI. AI is a horizontal technology. All of us will have to embrace AI, right? And some industries may be, significantly disrupted because AI can do those simple tasks incredibly well and better than humans, right? So those industries are going to be transformed. But if we all embrace AI and our staff and our leaders know how to do it, and we remain very entrepreneurial and agile, I'm confident that we can evolve and adapt with it. So that's how, as an established business, we would see that, right? But again, AI as a technology and what you can do with it and which industries you can go and service is such a vast field, and that's where vast amount of investment money is going. I have a good friend who invests only in AI companies that go very deep in verticals. There are some AI companies that go very broad, try to do everything. They are these global LLM companies. They are only a handful. But the real value could also be going deeper into every industry and having AI solutions that caters to a particular industry and being the best at it.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for coming and speaking with us today. That was a really interesting conversation. And I think if we could just put our hands together one more time for Dev.
Well, thank you for having me.